replenished.
People, including us. And people are filtering in.
I gotta say, this tea is delicious.
So did we open with talking about lentils, which was our pre-webinar beginning discussion? We still have people trickling in, so we'll wait a few minutes to get into the important conversations.
And then we'll park the discussion.
I hope we get to debate, you know, what is the greater drink? Lemon with hot water or lemongrass tea? Because right now I'm pretty convinced.
Do you have honey in your tea?
No, it's lemongrass and blueberry. So it's not just pure lemongrass, but I take it from the source. I don't dilute it with sugars.
As moderator, I'm just glad you're both taking care of your voices so we can keep clear debate and active, vigorous oral advocacy for each of your positions.
Yes.
Hmm.
I don't know how much of a debate it's going to be, but we'll see what time brings.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wait for a few more people to join, probably.
I see some names on there I recognize. Hello, friends.
I can't see the number of people joining. Richard, do we want to get going? Do we even have?
Yeah, I think so. We got 13 so far, and I'm sure people will, 16 all told. 13 plus our present company. So let's get going.
Yeah, for sure. Well, sorry, your name's not on the slides, Richard. He's joining us. It'll be there shortly. So I'm Victoria Merritt. I'm joined by my colleagues, David Brown and Richard, who will introduce themselves in a moment here. So you know the session today is being recorded, so that's already started. Before we dive in too far, we want to acknowledge that we practice our work and are giving today's presentation on the unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples. That includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So some introductions. David Brown.
That's me. Hi, everyone. I'm a lawyer and one of the co-founders of Ascent Employment Law, called in 2010. My practice, much like a lot of my colleagues, is labor and employment based. I also provide business immigration services for Ascent, and I work within human rights. Little known fun fact, I am the unofficial karaoke world champion 2015. But Richard's raising his hand. Yes, sir.
Maybe we could unpack that for a moment if you don't mind when you get to it.
Unpack the words of the carrot. All right. Well, in 2015, I traveled to Kyoto, Japan, where I participated in the Karaoke World Championships. It consisted of 6 songs that you had to present, and you were graded or judged, I suppose, on on tone, on costumes, on performance and adaptation. Ultimately, over the course of the tournament, I sang Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer, Metallica, Enter Sandman. I sang Bruno Mars, Uptown Funk, Helter Skelter by the Beatles. Can't remember the other ones though, but all told, I was a finalist with the respected karaoke artist Horatio Saki, and was fortunate to come out on top.
Dare we ask about costumes, David?
No, I think we should move on. Oh, and by the way, none of that story is true. So be careful. Be careful what you believe.
Oh, I love it.
Richard Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a co-founder and partner with Ascent, called out in Alberta in 2007 and then made my transition out here in 2010 and haven't looked back. I do all things workplace law and tend to do a fair amount of my practices, Canada Labor Code and workers' compensation law, just as kind of sub areas, but employment and human rights is the mainstay day in and day out. Having grown up in Ontario, I worked in a lot of manufacturing positions. I made screws. I took large blocks of veal and made them from a big block into smaller pieces called chipping veal. And I was in psychology in my undergrad, so I did some psych research, which I like to just keep that vague because people always wonder what that is and they think you have some Svengali power. So I will leave it at that, but pleasure to be here.
Right, and I'm Victoria. I was called in Alberta at first as well, and I'm happily now in BC. Similar to David and Richard, employment law and human rights is our bread and butter. I grew up in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. And this is a true story. I can't believe David's fact was fictitious. One of our firm values is honesty, as you all know. So we'll have an offline discussion maybe. So my fact is true. And my first job was feeding sled dogs at age 11, which I enjoyed greatly. So today we're talking about everyone's favorite topic that has been exhaustively discussed for, what are we at, 2 years? Mm-hmm. I can't even keep track. So we're gonna do a quick bit of an update on current, like where we're at in BC. We're gonna be talking about some of the health and safety risks moving forward, but most of the substance of today's discussion is gonna be in a gentle debate format with the takeaway that reasonable people can disagree on the best path forward. And I think reasonable people do disagree. So that is going to be moderated by Richard. And we'd love to hear from you and get questions from you. We know people continue to have lots of questions about COVID-19 as things evolve. So please use the Q&A function to get your questions into Richard, and he will be monitoring that for us.
Perfect.
So, state of the pandemic. Where are we now? We have hospitalizations in BC down to 329. BC continues to report new cases and deaths, sadly, on a daily basis. There's still almost a significant number of active cases in the province, which kind of surprised me, but I think this speaks to the shift with vaccinations, where the focus is now more on hospitalizations as opposed to as COVID. And as of March 6th, and these numbers vary depending what you're looking at, but basically 86% of BC's population has had at least their first dose of the vaccine. So quite high. So we're in a very different place today than we were if we'd been doing this presentation a year ago. Current restrictions, there's a caveat here that this doesn't apply to healthcare settings where there continue to be a lot of restrictions in other areas like long-term care homes for obvious reasons. But as of March 11th, I think in a surprise move to some, masks are no longer required. That includes indoor common areas of the workplace. Of course, if you want to have masking policies in place, you still can. And then coming up in April, proof of vaccination will not be required, so that vaccine card, and businesses will not need a COVID-19 safety plan. So pretty significant lifting. We're also starting to see travel. I'm sure people are planning trips. They're monitoring the changes there. There's been some more announced by the federal government again just this week. So things are moving along with the pandemic. This I thought was interesting. There's been a shift in the news coverage on this to kind of a focus on pandemic. And then when do you switch to an endemic stage? And kind of when is the pandemic over? And one of the funniest quotes I saw was that it's not over until World Health Organization says it's over, which I don't know what their metrics are for that. But it's encouraging that there's at least beginning to be discussion about what the end of the pandemic looks like. But it's ultimately not over, even though I think people are ready for it to be. And this is something David and I will both talk about. And there continues to be warnings about future waves. So one of the other things that's going to come up in our discussion is people are moving forward at their own pace. I really like this graphic from the government. I'm sure you've all seen it before, but where people's comfort level is with these restrictions lifting and kind of moving on, if we want to put it that way, is very different. So this is just our contact information, which most of you will have. And I'm going to flip things over to Richard to begin our reasonable people can disagree debate, discussion, whatever we'd like to call it. I guess we'll see.
I love it. So as we have dubbed it, reasonable people can agree, and lawyers have had to, just as a bit of an overview, this is my opinion, but we've taken all the legal principles that we knew as of, say, late 2019, early 2020, and we've had to superimpose those on this situation that none of us have ever dealt with in our generation. So as lawyers, we basically are forced to make judgment calls based on sometimes the most reasonable application of existing legal principles to COVID. So that creates a fertile ground for debate and for approaches. And so I've got a set of questions that I would like to put to the illustrious David Brown and Victoria Merritt today, and have you discuss them as I go through. And I'll be watching the chat again. If people have questions that will come up, please, I encourage you to use this. Victoria, I think you said, if memory serves, 86% is the vax rate right now. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's from the federal government, total population. And that's just first dose. So you could get into that with more granularity, but the rough number.
Okay. So what we're going to talk about first is, are employers ready to move on from COVID-19 in terms of getting back to whatever normal life for the business would have been? So that's going to be our topic that we're going to take you all through now. And I would like you two to kind of start us off. Take us from there. What do you think?
Can I launch a poll first, Richard, to see what our audience thinks?
I would love to hear what our audience thinks.
All right. You should now be able to answer the question: do you feel your business is in a position to move on from the pandemic? They're coming in. This is always so exciting to me. And Richard, can you see those numbers as well?
I can. This is fantastic. Yeah. So far the yeses are edging out the no's, but 20% are no's. And then 1 out of 10, 1 out of 11, no, I don't know. So a bit of a mixed bag, I think, from the results that we're seeing from all of our respondents. So 8 yeses, 2 no's, and 1 I don't know. Thanks for that. And so I would like then to turn it over to David or Victoria. I'll let you fight it out for who goes first. But what are you hearing from your employer clients? And what are you, from a legal perspective, advising in terms of next steps? Take us through it.
Maybe I'll get started because I haven't said anything yet here. I love to hear my own voice. So I think that what I'm hearing from a lot of businesses is they are ready to move forward from COVID-19. I think a lot of the population is ready to move forward. from COVID-19. I think there's a recognition that there's going to be a need for ongoing flexibility going forward. As Victoria has suggested, we still live with this virus circulating among the population, and we know that the virus can continue to mutate, and some of these mutations may create more serious strains than what we're currently dealing with right now. But at least I am cautiously optimistic that the worst is behind us. Omicron ripped through huge portions of the population, which I think is going to provide some natural immunity in addition to the vaccinated immunity that we've had through our very successful vaccine campaigns. I think the biggest challenges going forward are actually going to have little to do with the law and more to do with business operations and human resources. In particular, I think that in a lot of sectors right now, the economy is firing on all cylinders. If anything, it might even be overheated. And we're seeing that most acutely in the labor market. So there's been some talk about like this great recession or this great reset. I don't know if that translates perfectly well to Canada, but what I can say with a lot of confidence is there's many industries right now that are having really acute skill shortages, and it's very difficult to hire for these positions. It's very difficult to retain for these positions. We're seeing wage inflation across the board, which tells me that that's an indicator to me that maybe traditional bargaining power, which may have existed between companies and individuals, is shifting, where workers, especially workers that have skills that are in demand, are in a better position than ever before, at least in my experience, to come forward and say, I need a raise, I need better benefits, I need better responsibilities because there's 6 jobs down the road with my name on it if I'm willing. So I think that there's going to be a shift there from the perspective of employers, and the retention piece and the attraction piece are going to be ongoing challenges for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I do note that for those of you who probably a lot of you will know this, but June 1, we're having a minimum wage increase in BC. So it's going to go to $15.65. So yeah, we see indicators that things are turning around, but it's a bit of a lopsided market in terms of employers and employees. And
yeah, that wage increase is really interesting too, because what the BC government has done, which I think is actually quite progressive and it's never been done previously, is that minimum wage is now going to be tied to inflation. So previously there would be these occasional bumps in minimum wage, but you could also see like years that would go by without any minimum wage increases. And especially in a period now where inflation is elevated, at least in the last 30 years, I think that's an interesting move by the provincial government to kind of ensure that bargaining power is being maintained for our lowest income earners.
Yeah, great comment.
Purchasing power, not bargaining power. Purchasing power for our lowest wage earners are being retained.
Great comments, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. Victoria, what's your take on this? Are people ready to have business move forward and kind of just take off and forget about COVID?
I think people are ready, but I don't know that people can. So I'm the traditional pessimistic lawyer. One of my brothers calls the legal department in his company the no department, which I guess is the view I'm taking today. I just think it's too soon. And I think, we've been in places before. It was actually funny prepping for this presentation. I went back and looked, some of like the BC restart plan and things. Those were before this most recent wave. So I think we've been in a position before of looking to the end of the pandemic with optimism, and that was not what actually happened. So I think there's risks of government restrictions being put back. Do I think we'll see the extent of lockdowns, for example, or uncertainty we saw 2 years ago? Definitely not. But I don't think we're out of the woods yet. And I think from a business perspective, you really need to be cognizant of different people's risks here. Because there's some segments of the population who remain at very high risk for poor outcomes from COVID. There's people who have considerable anxiety and stress and mental distress around the pandemic. And I think the other piece is, and I think I phrased this question originally, but to say moving on, I don't think people are able to just move on from something like a pandemic. I think we need to adapt. We need to learn to live with it. And there's going to be kind of a new normal that's crafted as opposed to a return to pre-pandemic life. And again, that's a very cynical, lawyerly pessimist view, but that would be my comment on that initial question.
Cautious optimism. It is very lawyerly. And it's so steeped in human factors, isn't it? Two things, if I could, then. I'm going to ask one question from the audience, and that is back to the minimum wage issue in terms of making assessments on minimum wage. I think this goes to David's point about we'll assess it based on inflation. They had promised 6 months notice, which obviously didn't happen. So any comments on what you anticipate when they roll out these new inflation-based increases to minimum wage?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. Unfortunately, I don't know. This is a very new announcement, and I basically just read this like in the news. I haven't explored the actual legislation on this yet, so I don't know how or how often they're going to be pinning minimum wage to inflation. Perfectly legitimate question. I don't have the tools yet to answer that.
Victoria, you have a crystal ball?
No, but if I can chime in, this sounds like a great topic for us to do a blog post on and get out to all of you folks. And that question will, I think, be top of mind for a lot of people. So we'll look to provide more information on that in that format, since we can do so today.
Great point. And whenever things like this do come up, we do blogs twice a week. We try to release them on Tuesdays and Thursdays on topical issues, whether it's a video or an actual true blog. So watch for that on our website. The second question, and I'm putting you two on the spot, and this is a question I have, is regardless of whether you think we're in a, go out and get them sort of environment business-wise, or we're going to be a little more, people are more reticent to move forward. Can you throw out there what you each foresee as the pain points in, and that's my phrasing, but what are the impediments or the things we're going to have to deal with as an economy in BC to move forward to whatever that new normal looks like? David?
Well, I've already touched on one of these. This is not new news, but I think that labor shortages and housing shortages are going to be major impediments for economic growth in the coming years. I'm really sensitive to that. I think that there's so many easy answers to solve both of these serious issues here, and they're just getting stuck in bureaucracy and stuck in mediocre minds, right? So another impediment that may impact some businesses more than others, I think we actually might be exploring this a little bit later, but we see some tensions in the whole remote work, and whether that's going to be moving towards in office, which I know a lot of employers are starting to advocate for, or remaining home. How does that play out? Are there any kind of assumed contractual changes that the pandemic has presented where maybe now there's an expectation that employees can work remotely? And then again, another point that I think we're going to be touching on later in this talk is there's a lot of division right now, and a lot of it has come out or been magnified by the pandemic. You only need to think about vaccine mandates and convoys and masking requirements and is Bill Gates a bioterrorist? Like, there's a lot of challenges in our communities, and that is going to come into the workplace on some level. And that's why I want to come back to a theme that we had started with, which is you can acknowledge different viewpoints without agreeing, and you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that some level of acceptance within workplaces on these challenging topics is going to be fundamental in order to have functioning workplaces.
Love it. Thank you. Victoria, anything additional in terms of what you see as the points of friction that we need to kind of address as we go forward?
Yeah, I think people are tired, and I think there's still a lot of uncertainty in some sectors, fear, and then something David just picked up on, the increased polarization. So I think for a lot of people, the last 2 years have been very hard for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, it disproportionately impacts certain segments of the population. So, for example, I know women, there's lots of stats coming out now that they went back and took on increased childcare responsibilities at a disproportionately higher rate than their male colleagues, for example. So the other impact, I think, from the pandemic is it's increased some of the gaps between the haves and have-nots in Canada in a very interesting way. So the pandemic was actually financially beneficial for quite a few people, both individuals and businesses, depending on sector. On the other hand, it also financially devastated other industries. So travel, for example, my father was an airline pilot for 30 plus years. And so, he has a lot of contacts there. So anecdotally, and through our own work, travel, for example, is an industry that's been hit really hard. And I totally agree with David's comment on employee retention and the labor market. And I think COVID, and this is maybe not a negative, but it forced people to reevaluate their priorities and what they want out of, their own life and their jobs, and, sort of what's important to me. Is that being home with my family? Do I want to go back to an hour commute into the city for my job? Am I happy here? So I think it sort of forced this almost existential crisis on society as a whole that people are still sorting through and also still feeling the impacts of. And mental health, for example, is another area where I think we're still seeing, I felt like the past year or so, the concerns we get around mental illness and bullying and harassment, which can overlap, have increased significantly in the workplace. And I think that goes back to some of what David was saying around the polarization with COVID topics and just the impact of the pandemic on people as human beings.
Yeah, I love it. And that's a great segue then. So we kind of taken it from the macro and kind of issue spotting, right? And where we stand now. And so let's dig into it a little bit more, if I may. What health and safety measures, a big question that's coming up now as well, where does this leave us with masks going by the wayside, at least officially in terms of being mandated in many sectors? What health and safety measures should remain in place in the work, in our businesses, in the workplace, if any? Victoria, let's start with you.
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
So I think many of them, and I actually think some of them are things we probably should have had in place pre-pandemic with the benefit of hindsight, like sick policies where people don't come to work. I remember going to work sick. And now I'm like, oh, that was madness. But it was completely socially acceptable to show up and, fight through a cold. So things like having sick policies and encouraging people to stay home when they're sick. Same with things like proper hand hygiene, sanitization, not overly crowded spaces. Those measures, I think, make a lot of sense. And interestingly, I think what your workplace looks like is going to tie into the question of remote work. So some of the health and safety measures you have in place will be different if you have a collaborative office environment or you have people kind of coming in, once or twice a week, as opposed to a full return to everyone's in their own office 5 days a week. I think that'll also impact what health and safety measures you want to have in place, and obviously the type of work you do. So it's hard to generalize to every workspace because, again, if you're working with vulnerable populations, yeah, you should probably still have employees masking and have all your safety measures stay in place for now. Whereas if you have remote workers or you have an empty office, you can probably relax some of those where you can.
Prudence, but situation dependent.
Yes.
Makes sense. David, what's your take on this issue?
I think that's very sensible what Victoria's saying. And yeah, absolutely. Staying home when you're sick and hand washing these are this is good advice in good times, right? Let alone in the pandemic. One thing that I wanted to just quickly speak to is mental health. So, and this isn't so much like a takeaway from the pandemic, but it's a good reminder. So there's been some talk about how our population has been kind of living with this elevated and sustained level of stress.
Mhm.
Whether that flows from the pandemic, whether that flows from world wars, whether that flows from flooding and housing crisis and whatever else, right? There's a lot going on right now. Now, I'm going to play bad cop for a second in that I don't know if I've seen actual research which has kind of documented this kind of sustained mental health crisis. In my own practice, I don't know if I have seen like a material difference like in mental health pre-pandemic and mental health during or heading into post-pandemic. But that's an incredibly small sample size, and that's not really material. So I don't know what I'm saying there, but if there is mental health concerns that are coming out of the workplace, as employers, as people who work in human resources, of course, we need to recognize that as we have for decades now, we have a duty to accommodate. That process includes maintaining an engaged dialogue with the employee to have a clear understanding of what their needs and accommodations are. That includes exploring reasonable accommodations and making sure that you have the necessary medical information to adapt your workplace for those individuals. And in my mind, accommodation in a lot of ways involves out-of-box thinking. We are going to get a lot of accommodation requests for remote work. And I think that the approach to that should be systems-based. It should be the same process that is followed every time where a legitimate analysis takes place. It's not just a fast yes, it's not just a fast no, but recognizing as well that when an employer is able to properly accommodate and remove barriers to employment, they are allowed to choose the accommodation method which is best suited for their business. So hopefully that makes sense. But as is so often the case, there's many ways to skin a cat, and the employer is entitled to identify and rely on the accommodation method which is best aligned with business interests.
Sage advice from my partner, David. Thank you, sir. Quick extrapolation from what you're both saying then, in terms of and this question came up for me last week. Let's say that you've got no obligation in a workplace to wear masks from a public health order perspective. Can an employer in general impose that or require masks if there's some general level of acceptance amongst their staff? Like, is it okay to go above and beyond what's the minimum requirement in your workplace, or is an employer potentially going to be in trouble for that?
My expectation here is that employers are entitled to create the rules of engagement for their workplace, right? As long as they're legal, as long as they respect legal norms and they accommodate as needed and so forth. But if an employer wants to move forward slower than is required under public health, there is nothing preventing them from doing that. They're allowed to sustain the message that we are not ready, we are not comfortable with this, we are going to continue to wear masks and require vaccination and do whatever else we need to do on a go-forward basis until that business deems that it's no longer necessary. That's my hot take. There may be instances where that's not appropriate, but I would want to look at that kind of on a case-by-case basis.
That was my advice. Victoria,
Good.
what do you, and that is the approach that I've generally been taking as well on that issue. I completely agree. Victoria, did you have a contrary view? This is a safe space.
I want to play devil's advocate, but I don't. I think the reality is that lots of businesses are keeping measures in place. I actually think, and we saw this a lot with the Alberta government's approach to the pandemic, where it tended to be more of a, well, we're not going to require things, but businesses, you can. And it actually puts you as a business owner or employer in a tougher spot, because now you don't have the fallback of, well, we have to, right? Mask, that wasn't an optional policy, you had to. So you have this really nice legal backing that employers, your employees can be as mad as they want at the government, but it's not you. Although of course some employers have taken strong stances on this throughout anyways. I also think it's just socially responsible, and in some cases a good business measure to keep safety policies in place, because I think people, and this goes back to the fear and uncertainty and people moving at different speeds. For example, retail shops, I think lots of customers are more comfortable going somewhere where there's masks in place, especially if it's a smaller crowded business. So I think there's lots of reasons why it makes sense to keep those in place.
Yeah,
for sure.
Like just anecdotally, sorry to interrupt you, Victoria, but
No, go ahead.
you go to grocery stores, you go to pharmacies, and maybe I'm not fully informed of what the requirements are, but these businesses are all maintaining masks for the time being. It seems to be very common, in the last week since the changes have been made. It continues to be very common, and I suspect that those decisions are enforced on a company level rather than on a government policy level.
Yeah. And I'm just going to touch on a comment that we've got from Jen. So Jen says, I think the sick policy is a great option for another blog highlighting double dip concept, annual versus work anniversary concept, casual part-time, temporary versus full-time. Great input. We want the blogs to suit your needs. They're there for you. So we will be doing that. Thanks a lot, Jen. And then you've also indicated that you've elected to keep the mask mandate and vaccine mandate, and will commit to reviewing it regularly as you're a food processing plant and have about 90% of your workers in congregate living. Not just helpful that the government has dumped this on employers and pushed back on all responsibility. We completely understand where you're coming from in terms of it being just kind of open season to interpret things, and there's a lot of gaps in the information we're being given. We've dealt with that since the beginning of COVID as employment lawyers. Cannot agree more. Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm. And the lack of notice, I think, is the other piece that's very frustrating for businesses. And again, that's been a theme for 2 years now, where things have shifted. But the landscape's changed sometimes overnight for businesses. So at least now you're in the position of being able to control that a little bit more, subject to any big next wave.
And I'm really nosy here. I'm going to ask, I think you have a poll set up in terms of whether people are keeping health and safety measures in place for this foreseeable future. Is that the case?
Yeah, I will launch that poll right now. This is worded very broadly, so I apologize. Health and safety measures, meaning obviously masking, sanitization.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, well, what you're seeing is that my interpretation of this is that most companies are just not de facto going to pre-pandemic health and safety, right? It seems like for all of the negative of the pandemic, there were actually some really good learning lessons to take away from this that they're going to continue to adopt on a go-forward basis. Because nobody is saying, are you keeping health? Nobody is saying no, they're not keeping health and safety measures in place.
That's right. Nobody's blowing the doors
Either
open.
yes all or yes some. So that's quite telling.
Okay, fantastic. So moving on then, and we had a question that I want to make sure we answer about whether employers can update their vaccination policy to require only new employees be vaccinated as a condition of hire. and no longer apply to existing employees. I'm going to put that out there, but I'm going to park it for a moment and just ask if we can move on then to the issue of vaccine mandates, because it's a hot topic right now. And again, I think, Victoria, you're gonna get some feedback from the audience, correct?
Yeah, so this question is, will you be keeping any existing vaccine mandates in place? And we can't see who is given which answer, by the way, so it is an anonymous poll.
Interesting again.
Okay.
So it looks like what I'm seeing is that those of us who had vaccine mandates have no immediate plans to rescind them.
That's right. That's how I read that as well. Okay. So vaccine mandates. Let's talk about it. Let's get after it. Are they still enforceable? David Brown, what say you?
Okay. So I want to, Victoria and I are going to present opposing views on this.
It's a yes or no, sir.
And I want to start by acknowledging that there's a bit of an intentional debate here. So if you phoned me up last week and you said, that's not what you told me on the phone, just recognize that we're trying to maintain an engaged conversation with pros and cons, and there are pros and cons to both sides of the story, okay? I do have thoughts on this, though. I do have thoughts on this. I think that vaccines, and everyone can feel free to disagree with David, okay? I'm used to that. I'm used to that. So in my mind, when vaccines were introduced, they were introduced with creating 4 protections. And they may not do all of these, they may only do some of them, but these are the intentions of the vaccines: to prevent infection, to prevent spread or lessen the risk of spread if you are infected, to reduce the risk of serious illness, and reduce the risk of serious death. Obviously, death is serious, reduce the risk of death. So the reason why I've shifted my views on vaccine mandates is when we were dealing with the original strain of COVID-19, a lot of businesses introduced vaccine mandates primarily to reduce the risk of a workplace outbreak. Okay, so to reduce the risk of infection and reduce the risk of spread. I'm not saying that there were no concerns for public safety or for the safety of our workers if they did get sick or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying, but I don't believe those were the primary concerns. The primary concerns were to avoid large-scale workplace outbreaks. That applied to the original strain of COVID-19. That applied to the Delta variant, because where the original vaccine results were showing something like 90+% effectiveness against the original strain, it was still something in the range of 70 to 75% effective against Delta. And that was the rules that we were playing with right through until early December, right? So when a lot of companies came forward and were announcing these vaccine mandates, I fully endorsed them and I helped companies put them in place. And I thought they were fantastic ideas because they would reduce the serious risk of infection and workplace breakouts. Then along came Omicron. And what I say is, when do you change your opinion? You would change your opinion when the facts change. And I think that was a moment where we had to seriously question whether or not these very divisive policies were a positive ongoing force in the workplace, okay? Because what we discovered is that vaccines the existing vaccines that we had continued to be very effective in preventing serious illness and continued to be very effective in preventing death, but they were now very ineffective in preventing transmission, either by getting infected or spreading it on to somebody else. And that that then brought me to ask the question, why are we still going ahead with vaccine mandates? The expectation that I had is that if the vaccines are no longer effective in preventing workplace outbreaks, then why do employers need them? And sure, you can argue that we want everybody to be healthy, but that's, on some level, that's a personal health choice. And I understand as well that there's implications for the rest of the community, and there's implications for our health system and so on. But really, the risk of serious illness, the risk of death, is in large part borne by the individual. So now we're coming into February and March. If you had your vaccine mandates in place, my expectation is that by this point in time, they will have in large part fulfilled their mandate, because I'm expecting that at this point in time, you have a workplace that is in large part vaccinated. And if there are stragglers, they may have, this is going to sound very off-putting, but kind of dealt with themselves. They may have moved on, or they may have found work elsewhere, or whatever the case may be. People don't stay unemployed for long in this economy. I come back to the basic question of what ongoing purpose do vaccine mandates serve to businesses? And I do question their ongoing merit. I do question that. And I think at this point in time, if you are looking to terminate on the basis of compliance with the vaccine mandate, or if you are looking to not hire on the basis of a vaccine mandate, not hire, maybe not, but if you're terminating on the basis of this decision, I don't view this as a just cause termination. This is basically a business choice that conflicts with an individual choice. And as a business, you are going in a different direction, and then severance would be payable. That's my piece. Feel free to disagree.
Well, let's see if we have any contrary opinion from Ms. Merritt here. Still enforceable, Victoria, or what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, if they were enforceable in December 2021, they're enforceable now. So that's my very simple stance.
Yeah.
There's no, really though, right? So if you had them in place in December and they were defensive, justifiable and defensible, then they continue to be justifiable and defensible. For how long? That's a really hard question. And we would have recommended, and I think most lawyers helping craft vaccine mandates would recommend having some sort of sunset clause. And at some point, you do need to decide, okay, what's our long-term plan? But from my perspective, vaccines continue to be, the most effective way to deal with the impacts of the pandemic, including, sort of some social responsibility to protect the health and safety of others. In some environments, I think, so for example, the requirement for certain workers to be vaccinated under different government legislation, so federal, certain federally regulated workers, healthcare workers, for example, those rules haven't changed. Those are not being repealed back. There's you no longer need to be vaccinated.
Right.
David looks like he disagrees with that.
No.
No?
I have a comment that I would like to chime in.
He'll bide his time. And I think going forward, you can think about, for our business, do we have the sort of business where we want to be hiring people we know are vaccinated? And the other piece with the vaccines, which is challenging, and I've never said I'm not a doctor more than I have in the past 2 years, mostly talking to employees who were vaccine hesitant, if I can put it that way. So I'm not a doctor, so I can't speak authoritatively on the medical piece, but you still get your flu shot, hopefully, even though it's not 100% effective and it might have missed some strains of flu. So I think we're going to see a shift in public health policy that you can potentially mirror as an employer to treating this. And again, this is, I think, the pandemic-endemic shift, right? Okay, how do we deal with this long term? COVID's going to continue to exist. People are going to continue to transmit and contract it. But what protections do we want in place? And vaccines continue to be, kind of the gold standard. But I do think you now have, the further into 2022 we go, assuming the trends continue, right? And it's obviously difficult to predict if there's a new variant, and then what's the vaccine effectiveness on that. Those are all unknowns. But I think they continue to be something you can have in place. You do need to be prepared to justify and defend those for your workspace. And so some of the guidance I love is from the BC Human Rights Commissioner, actually, on vaccine policies. So this is their language, not mine. But they talk about them being justified by scientific evidence relevant to the specific context. So your workplace, time limited and regularly reviewed. You know, we review this every 3 months, every 6 months. Proportional to the risks they seek to address. So what are they doing? What's their efficacy? And that there's not some less intrusive or easier measure, like allowing people to continue to work remote. So I don't think you have carte blanche to just have a vaccine mandate. You need to put the thought and time into why does this make sense for our workplace? But I'd reiterate my original point, which is if they were enforceable in something you wanted 4 months ago, they're enforceable in something you probably want today. But I know David disagrees.
He's chomping at the bit. And one thing I do want to say then is, well, I was going to ask, can they stay indefinitely? And so it sounds like, given the advice from the commission, if they're scientifically based and you're constantly looking at them, even every 3 to 6 months, it sounds like an indefinite, just leave it as is not a palatable answer. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think, so healthcare context, for example, I expect we're going to see things like masks required in hospitals and vaccine requirements for healthcare workers. I think those are going to become much more standard than they were pre-pandemic and in those contexts. For employers, I think at some point you shift your policy to a longer term, you know, what are we going to require? And you'll have to revisit them anyways, because the language in some, for example, would have only contemplated first and second doses. So it doesn't deal with boosters. Right. So what's your expectation around boosters, right? Like there's a number of logistical things that need to continue to factor in. And I guess to answer the question on the floor really quickly, as long as David can remember his points, for new employees, I think, again, if you can justify it, you can continue to require employees to be vaccinated. You know, it's not, if it's, and again, the only human rights piece here is if there's some sort of reason they can't be, but for most people who aren't being vaccinated, like the vast majority, it's a personal choice. And that's not something protected under human rights legislation. And you as an employer can decide, no, we do want people to be vaccinated. You know, maybe you provide care to elderly people, or you're a public-facing business. I think you can continue to do that going forward. For the foreseeable future, I don't know about forever.
Sage advice, Counselor. Thank you. Mr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Well, I want to challenge Ms. Merritt on this concept that if it was enforceable, if it was justifiable 4 months ago, it should be justifiable now. And the trouble that I have with that is that you're creating an outcome that's based on different facts, because the circumstances that we were finding ourselves in November and December are not the circumstances that we're facing right now. And as I was saying, the biggest shift here, the biggest difference that we've been seeing in this are the differences between Omicron and Delta. Delta was, you know, fast spreading, but was still continued to be highly, you know, the vaccines were highly effective in preventing spread of Delta. And Omicron, the vaccines are not highly effective. So I think that it's a responsible employer is going to be taking those facts very seriously and looking at them and taking them into consideration when assessing the ongoing merits of their vaccine program, because it's not an apples to apples situation, unfortunately. Something else that I kind of draw parallels on here, even though they're completely different, but that I often look to as a parallel is the vaccine service card, or the vaccine passport that people use. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think there's important analogies here is that vaccine card, and while you're required to show it in order to access, you know, a number of non-essential services like restaurants and cinemas and concerts and everything else, it's again designed to prevent spread. Okay, there may be a certain part of it that's designed to, coerce people into behavioral change, but the biggest reason behind it is to prevent public spread. And so what I'm kind of challenged with right now is that if Bonnie Henry and the BC CDC and Adrian Dix are coming forward and saying that the vaccine passport system is no longer going to be required come April 1st, they're communicating that it's no longer effective in preventing community spread, or that we're at a stage in this pandemic where it's no longer necessary because we have reached a point of herd immunity or something akin to that. Okay, so if you don't require a vaccine status to get into a restaurant, then why do you require your vaccine status to get into your place of business?
And I guess my
unmuted.
Yeah, quick and sassy comment back is that's not till April 8th, David. So it's not yet today. But no, I mean, it is a good point, right? And one of the things we talked about is that employers have been able to kind of mirror public health recommendations. But I suppose, and perhaps this is the core of our disagreement, is, why did you put it in place in the first place? And if it's because there's some sort of social responsibility, for example, to help incentivize vaccine mandates, and then also to ensure people's health and safety. So, while some people certainly have mild cases of COVID, there's also still lots of unknowns and lots of concern around long COVID, for example, and the symptoms there.
Yep.
And I think the other piece, and this is a bit of a digression, but some of the commentary I've seen that's very compelling is kind of the ableist nature of the conversations around moving on, and the government saying, okay, enough's enough, let's get on with our lives. And I think that does leave a chunk of the population very vulnerable and scared if they're immunocompromised. Or, you care for elderly parents. So the other thing I think is the majority of people are vaccinated. So one of the other pieces that I think gets lost between the very vocal minority is that for most people, vaccine mandates weren't controversial. They were already vaccinated, or they had no issues getting vaccinated to keep, to stay employed. So it's a pretty small, I guess, percentage. And this is more of a challenge than a response back. But I do think it's challenging to know what to do with those employees now who were unvaccinated, perhaps put on an unpaid leave, perhaps, as you said, David, had already dealt with things. What do you do with them now? So that's more of a question. And I definitely think it's something employers will need to grapple with. I just think it's almost too soon, if that makes sense. And maybe we're quibbling over a month, David. So if you ask me April 8th, that might change. But it's, I think it depends again. Why did you put it in place in the first place? And I also disagree. Like, I think vaccines continue to be effective at reducing hospitalizations, reducing ICUs. The reason we can have high active cases now and continue functioning is because of vaccines. So I don't think the reasons for having people get vaccinated have really shifted as much as you, I believe.
So
yeah.
I agree with you though, Victoria, on that point. They do prevent serious illness. They do prevent spread, okay? I think there's something inherently like paternalistic though about a company, which is a private enterprise, saying, we know what's best for you, and therefore we are going to require this of you. I think that companies should be primarily focused on what is in the best interest of their enterprise. And that's not to say that, what's in the best interest of the enterprise are completely divorced of what's in the best interest of the individual. But where there is a difference between the two, I think that, anyways, I'll leave it there. I think it's, we have some questions and I think we should probably move on, but I'll leave it there.
I love it. And I thank you for the spirited debate, because we had David actually in the comments said that the conversation's making him twitch because he personally agrees with Victoria, but professionally he agrees with David. And I think, and again, it's anecdotal, right? It's just my experience, but I think we are grappling with that as groups of business leaders who are running operations, and we're making these professional decisions, and then we're leaving a, whenever we're leaving the workplace, remote workplace, whatever, and we're thinking as individuals in our personal capacity, and therein lies some of the conundrum that we face as citizens and business owners or management. And so, David, comment on that?
I want to say that I totally agree with David.
Yeah.
Personally, I totally agree with Victoria. Personally, I'm triple vaxxed. Personally, I recognize the ongoing need to have an active vaccination campaign. But I also am very uncomfortable with ongoing impositions on personal choice and personal liberties if they're no longer required. And I'm questioning the requirement at this stage.
Yeah.
And what do we do then? Okay, so just a couple of really rapid fire questions on this, because I think it's something that people are grappling with from what we're hearing. If you got a vaccine mandate in place, let's assume you're going to take it away for your existing employees, but can you still require new incomers who are getting hired to be vaccinated?
Here's your classic lawyer answer. It depends.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
if you can justify it, yes. So one of the other challenges with all of these discussions, and that's been really difficult advising clients on legal risk, is I think everyone is out of their depth from the scientific medical perspective here, right? So you rely as a business on kind of the scientific and medical community consensus, whatever consensus there might be, which there's also disagreements, experts disagree. So I think that's one of the other, and this isn't directly on your question, Richard, but just it's a challenge because obviously the big question here is, okay, can we justify this, right? Is there a reason we need employees to continue to be fully vaccinated for the type of work we do? In some contexts, absolutely, right? Do you go into seniors' homes to provide care? Yeah, you can probably require your employees to be vaccinated. And then, if they don't want to be, they can choose other work. So I think that would be a quick answer to that question, but I'd be curious if David agrees.
Thanks, David.
I think there are going to be cases where you can require that. I think that by and large, though, we should be moving past vaccine mandates for most employers. Like Jen raised a really good fact pattern there where she's talking about you've got people in communal living, they work very, very closely together, they're in a manufacturing setting. That might be completely 100% justified, okay? But I think that most employers are not going to be in that boat. Another point that I just want to quickly touch on that I don't know why it's so easily dismissed, but we give zero credit or consideration for natural immunity. Zero consideration for people who have naturally contracted the virus and overcame it and have moved on and are going to have a strong, arguably an even stronger immune response than what you would get through an artificial vaccine. And I just can't get that. So if it's okay for you to ask the vaccine status of somebody of a new employee, wouldn't it be just as appropriate to ask if they've had if they've had COVID in the last 3 or 6 months? There may be a question there about proving it, but then again, there could have easily been workarounds to this, which we just have not established.
Okay. Thank you. And then final question on this issue, is it cause if people don't comply? So I know that this is going to be a loaded topic, but in general terms, what's your take on whether or not a failure to comply with a vaccine mandate by an employee comprises just cause to terminate?
I'm going to say in the vast majority of cases, the answer is going to be no. Now, again, these are fact dependent, and but an employer is going to have significant risk going into a hearing with a just cause case for a vaccine mandate. Okay. The argument would be insubordination. The argument would be about that they're non-compliant with health and safety measures. And let's be clear, those can be arguments for a just cause termination, particularly when there's been advance notice that there's going to be serious consequences of that. I think that it would be incumbent upon the employer to look at alternatives. Namely, is it possible, and we actually get this out of some of the arbitration decisions, because our arbitral union decisions move a little bit faster than our court systems. And so some arbitrators have been critical in saying, well, was it a possibility for remote work?
Right.
Because if it was, then maybe you shouldn't be terminated for cause. Was it a possibility that people continue to provide rapid tests once or twice a week to demonstrate that they don't have COVID? Because if it is, then you don't have cause. Is it a possibility that you can continue to require people who are non-vaccinated to wear masks or to undergo like regular sanitation regimes, like we were doing for the first 18 months of this pandemic? Because again, if that's an opportunity, then you probably don't have cause. So my conclusion on this is never say never, but it's going to be a high burden.
Victoria, thoughts?
Yeah, I largely agree with David on this, and I struggled a bit initially, and to answer the question for myself early on, I went back to the first principles really. So what's just cause? Irreparable break in the employment relationship due to the conduct of the employee. It's not fair to characterize refusal to get vaccinated as misconduct, I don't think. However, I would say, based on the stories I've heard over the past mostly year, often employees who are vocally not getting vaccinated may land themselves in hot water through other behavior. So sending a company-wide email, attaching misinformation, hate speech, threats, that sort of misconduct, I think, is lending itself to at least discipline, if not just cause. But the simple fact of non-compliance with the vaccine policy in most cases, I think you're going to have a hard time arguing for just cause. I know there are different views on that out in the legal community, and some, respected employment lawyers have communicated their views on social media and online that they think courts will be inclined to uphold terminations for cause. I just don't see the legal basis for that based on our existing principles around cause. Although the other thing David and I discussed briefly was for just cause, the revelation of character line of case law, right? So, and this is more of a practical consideration, but one of the learnings from the pandemic, perhaps for some employers, is, employee Y is not a really great fit at our company. They haven't been communicating their views respectfully. They have been causing 80% of the work for HR, even though they're one of 100 employees. So at that point, you always have the option to end the employment relationship. I just don't think you can do that with cause.
Thank you. And I'll just raise two really quick things. Number one is it reminds me of an instance where somebody gets in potential hot water for some allegation and they're being investigated. And there may not be any merit to what's being investigated, but they lie in the investigation, and then that becomes grounds for cause. So it's the stuff that's wrapped up in their approach, right? Love that point. Love this insubordination point, David. And then the second thing that I'll also raise is just the fact that even when we're dealing with these situations inside Ascent, when we're providing advice, employment standards may be something that in the instance is, an entitlement to the employee. So somewhere between, 0 and 8 weeks. But then in a hot market, that duty to mitigate means they could probably go out and find something. So there's still a lot of strategic navigating, even if you can't allege cause or don't want to allege cause. So still worthwhile looking at strategies there. Okay, I'm going to then move forward and leapfrog to another question, unless anybody has any final points. that okay? Remote, David, you touched on this earlier in terms of where you think things are going to be going, remote and hybrid work environment. So I want to shift our focus to that. We know that this has become something that's been at the forefront of business discussions for those employers that have been able to continue on with operations in some form. Do you think those are here to stay, or is that a COVID issue that's going to have people return to a brick and mortar workplace? David, comment on that.
I think that it's going to be here to stay, but I think it's going to be employer based. It's going to be employer driven, or actually it's going to be a mix of employer driven. I don't think you're going to find it in every workplace. So, I can share my personal views on this. Ascent loves remote working conditions. You can see from Richard, he's in his home office, Victoria's in her home office. Most of our team works remote, and we're strong advocates of it. We're strong advocates of it from the perspective of work-life balance, from the perspective of the environment, from the perspective of maintaining an engaged and happy workplace. Are there challenges with it? Yeah, there are some challenges with kind of maintaining team culture and perhaps in some instances, managing a remote work team. But from my perspective, the pros of remote work are there, and there are easy workarounds for some of the challenges that they present. Now, that being said, not everybody needs to agree with me on this, and obviously businesses are going to have to create a workplace that best aligns with what they're trying to achieve and with their vision. So if you're in a highly collaborative team environment, maybe it doesn't work. It can be as simple as that. My expectation is there's going to be a subset of the labor pool that are going to be increasingly insistent on remote work opportunities, and that those employers who lean into that will be able to tap into a less competitive labor field. And I think that's a real plus. I also want to just chime in here that remote work needs a lot of trust. There's got to be a very high level of functionality and trust that exists between management and staff. And if that trust does not exist, if you're questioning if people are going to be scrolling, doom scrolling Twitter all day long, this is not going to work. So in a way, it's you got to kind of either let go and embrace it and kind of live in that chaos that comes with it and find systems that can manage it, or you need to basically say, our workplace requires people to be here and present, and that's the path that we're taking. In our firm, we operate with a high level of trust. We trust our staff. We have regular check-ins. We have social lunches. We have team drinks. There's lots that we do to maintain an engaged workplace, and it's been largely successful. So I don't see us planning to change, and I'm happy to, consult with any companies that are looking at making some of these adjustments permanent.
Love the trust piece. Thanks for touching on that. Victoria, any disagreement there from your end, or any comments you want to add?
I think regardless of your opinions on remote work, love, hate, somewhere between, the horse is out of the barn and 100 kilometers down the road. I think you are not going back to a world of full office for everyone. Obviously, some workplaces require you to be in person. So a barista is with these doing our current technology, still having to go to a coffee shop to serve coffee. Yeah. So there's limits. But when we're talking about workplaces that can go remote, and actually this is really interesting in the legal profession. So one of my favorite jokes about lawyers is that if you took a surgeon from 1910 and you put them in an operating room today, they wouldn't recognize the equipment or be able to operate on their patient. If you take a lawyer from 1910 and you put them in a courtroom, way you go. That's a little exaggerated, obviously. Things have changed. But even law firms were forced to go remote, and lawyers are insisting on staying remote. And that is and same with banking, finance, some very traditional, slow, I would say technologically inept professions, again, speaking of lawyers, are being forced. And I think this goes to what David said. There is a segment of workers who will not go back to commuting to an office. So if you're interested in retention and you happen to operate in those workspaces, tech's another great example. I think the reality is you need to be open to hybrid or remote work, where you're going to have a real retention problem anyways, especially to return to one of David's really early comments, in a hot market, right, where employees they do have options. In terms of the logistics, I also agree with David. Obviously, there's some cons to remote work, team building, the social aspect, workplace culture, and just the ability to keep tabs on employees. What are you doing? What are you doing with your life? Are you working? How's your productivity? I think, as David said, there's ways to address all of those logistical pieces, but certainly it's not without its challenges. And I actually think hybrid work arrangements will probably become the most common, where you have some sort of office space that people still go to, right? Or you have more frequent firm retreats, or you require a once a month collaborative brainstorming session with your group. So what you do with your office space is another really interesting topic. One of my neighbors is an architect, and she redesigns office spaces, and they were super busy over COVID converting workplaces to be collaborative workplaces, so that when you're going to the office, it's not to sit quietly and draft policies, it's to debate, where are we taking this project as a team.
Yeah.
So I actually think it really opens a lot of opportunity for employers, along with some challenges, but none that are not, I guess, overcomable.
And I love the comment about law changing. When the legal framework, when the legal system changes to allow for video and telephone conferencing, wow, something's here to stay. So our profession moves relatively glacial, and so I think you're raising really good points about the evolution of work. Now, I have a quick question for both of you. If you've got a workplace that has 4 different kinds of jobs, 2 of which need to be in office or in warehouse or what have you, can you then have the other 2 positions go remote? Can you parse it out by position so that part of your workforce is working remotely, and then the people who have to be at a work site can be there?
I would say yes to that in most circumstances. I don't see
David, any
bars
disagreement?
that.
I don't see any reason why not. And in fact, that happens a lot. There are some jobs that you can't do remote. You can't be a construction worker working remotely, but you could be a construction firm's accountant or bookkeeper and work remote, right? So I think what I would be sensitive to is there's going to be questions about, again, coming back to culture and this feeling of people like to be treated equally. So if you've got 2 people in similar or identical roles, you're going to have to be questioning whether it's appropriate to be having one allowed to be working remote and one must be in the office. That's going to be a breeding ground for resentment, right? Or if they're similar capacity, like if you get a group of professionals that all work in a office type setting, allowing some people to work from home and some people to be required to be in the office, you would have to have a very clear justification in order to successfully implement that. But kind of just touching on what Victoria said, I think that there is increasing research that's showing the benefits of hybrid environments. And so what I honestly think we're going to be moving into here is spaces that maybe you don't have your assigned office, right? where every day you walk in, just like what I'm in right now, and you open the door and you sit down at your desk and you work at your computer and you have your photos of your kids up on the mantle and whatnot, right? I think there's a lot of interesting research happening where maybe you have a locker and you go into the office and you go to your locker and you take your personal items and you go back to to a desk, right? And you log on to the server from a computer.
Hot desking kind of, hey?
Yeah, I think, and a big reason why is that commercial real estate is incredibly expensive, and it financially impacts the bottom line when you don't have to pay that, or when you can significantly reduce the size of the enterprise, the physical size of the enterprise, in order to accommodate the same number of people. And I think as well that that's going to open up new money that can be invested in people and technology to make sustainable improvement, right?
Can I pick up on a point David made there about equal treatment of the same employee, for example? I think that's very important. And I think managing expectations around remote work is key, because you do not want to create a situation where employees assume I can work remotely regardless of how my performance is. So I think you know, some people thrive in a remote work environment, and some employees maybe do abuse it or are not productive with their time and need to be in an office with direct in-person supervision, right? That might be the reality for some employees. And this is where having a policy or individual remote work arrangements is key, especially if you want some expectation of in-person work from your employees, which I think most employers do, right? At some point, then you create an obligation around attending something like a firm retreat or a business, you know, collaborative day or team building events. I think managing expectations there. And then there's a great comment in the chat that I just saw about, you know, changes in body language.
Body language, yeah.
Yeah, which is really, so communication and having regular check-ins is really important. And it's actually, to some degree, a health and safety issue as well, that you know your employees are okay, you know, sort of physically and mentally, and you don't have the, oh, you know, you're looking really exhausted today. I mean, hopefully you don't open with that to your coworker, but you don't have those in-person kind of natural interactions that flow. So communication has to be a lot more intentional. And I think we're going to see more tools around helping employers manage that and businesses manage that continue to come out, and some tech solutions hopefully for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just make two really quick comments, if I may. Three, sorry. First one is we have a blog, just to plug our blog. If you are going to be looking at remote work arrangements, if you haven't already got one in place, you do want to make sure that you're accounting for any business expenses that come along with that. They cannot be foisted on the employee to bear the burden of. So we're talking a lot about reimbursements, monthly allowances to help people with the expense of home internet or what have you. So there's a blog out there on our website in relation to that. The second thing is we were talking a lot in 2019 about the gig economy and people performing work on a one-off basis. And I've just noticed, and I'm not sure if you two would share this, but independent contractor status and retaining independent contractors to perform certain business functions has now become a way of businesses looking to this future of what the workplace looks like to get task-based stuff done, either on a project basis or maybe on a just farm it out, contract it out, have somebody work somewhere and do your bookkeeping or your what have you on a contract basis 2 days a week. And so that can be a really novel way to try to deal with things without trying to manage your remote employees. And I'm finding that's really beneficial. And then the other thing is just an interesting case that came up. An Air Canada employee who was in Quebec, I believe, slipped and fell in the course of her remote work day. And the question was whether or not WorkSafe coverage engaged that slip and fall. And so do be checking on your employees. So regardless of how you arrange that, you should have a remote work policy in place, as Victoria mentioned, and that's really beneficial and something we're working on very frequently with our clients. Okay, in the last 6 minutes of our discussion, The great resignation is upon us, so the media tells us. Truth, myth, what say you both? Is there something to this, and what does it look like for us as employers moving forward? David.
Yeah, I think I've already touched briefly on this, but I don't, the Great Resignation comes out of the US. And I think when you look at some of the numbers that they're seeing down there, there is this, like, there's a major exodus from the workplace down there. Where they're going, are they looking for new work? Are they setting up their own businesses? Are they just saying, forget this, and removing themselves from the workplace or from the labor market? I don't get the impression that we're having the same, it looks the same in Canada. Now, this is entirely anecdotal, okay? So this is just based on observation and living in the trenches. But in my impression is that it's less a great resignation in Canada and more of a kind of a historic shift in employee-employer relations. And what I mean by that is employers usually have all the carrots and all the sticks, or almost all of them. There's a very unequal bargaining position that exists there, right? And that what I think you're seeing in the economy that we're experiencing today is that it started subtly, but now it's not so subtle all the time. It's being turned upside down. And, you hear stories about employers that are advertising for 6 months and they get 3 unqualified applications, for a job, right? You get stories of employees coming in with greater and greater demands, whether that's coming down to wages or profit sharing or whatever else, right? All very real. I think that's here to stay. No, I shouldn't exaggerate. It's not here permanently, but this is the labor reality that we're working through right now. Another point that I want to just very briefly touch on, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think we need to re-examine how we treat terminated employees, and specifically severance, the severance structure that we've created. Now, most of the people on this podcast are going to be this video, this webinar are going to be very familiar with having, employment contracts in place and stipulating in your employment contracts what termination rights are and so forth, right? But, not everybody does that. And a lot of businesses have these implied contracts in place where if you fire an employee, they are entitled to reasonable notice. And reasonable notice can be, somewhere between, 3 months for a year of service if you're a short-term employee, to anywhere between roughly a month for every year of service, if you've been working there for 12 years, right? So this idea of paying somebody 12 months wages to terminate their employment, I think that's gone for now, at least. And the reason being is that we can go back on our old case law and say that, this case says this and he should be entitled to this much money, and this case says this and this should be entitled to this much money. But the reality is that all of this is going to be subject to a duty to mitigate. And what that means is that the employee has an onus, a duty to go out and find comparable work. And when they find that work, your damages are capped, right? So what I'm thinking here is, on average, it's taking people between 2 and 4 months to transition on from new work, regardless of time they spent with their previous employer. And I think that a lot of businesses are taking very defensive approaches to paying out severance. They're doing a more of a wait and see, saying, okay, terminated employee, you go out and show me that you're looking for work. And then when you found new work, come back and we can talk severance.
That's great. Thank you. No gravy trains on David Brown's watch. Yeah, and I know you've blogged on this before, how severance is changing, the landscape is changing. Victoria, just in the interest of time, I want to leave you with the last word, but what say you on the Great Resignation? Is it something that you're seeing?
Yeah, I don't think it's a myth. I don't know if the way the media is portraying it, again, like David said, is very American based. I think employees are becoming increasingly divorced and dissatisfied with the 9 to 5 40-hour work week. I don't think a lot of employees don't want that anymore. So, Dolly Parton's song, As Great as It Is, I think is losing relevance. That always gets stuck in my head. But yeah, I think, a quick example would be a company like Amazon. They are desperate to hire software developers, desperate. And they're not finding people because people are choosing to work for smaller companies at lower salaries with better vacation or more flexible work arrangements or remote work arrangements. So I think some of the traditional hooks for employees, like money, right, compensation, I think is no longer enough for a lot of workers. So retention strategies need to change to reflect. Anyway, and this, I could talk about this for a long time, so I'll leave it there. There's a whole Reddit anti-work, which has some fascinating content. But I think there is a big cultural pushback against traditional work models. And we're going to continue to see that pushback over the next, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And people are looking for more engagement, not necessarily retirement and sitting on a beach.
Yeah.
At least that's what I'm seeing as well. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Victoria, for closing remarks, but just really appreciate the engagement and being able to moderate between your sage opinions. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks to David and to you for joining. For wrap up, we love to hear from you. So if you have topics you want us to speak to, our next huddle's April 14th. It's going to be on diversity and inclusion by Marla Calvert and Trevor Thomas. So watch for an invite to that. And if you have ideas for blog posts, sessions, burning questions, please let us know. We're here to serve you. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.